What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
I had been preparing for that day for months, counting down the hours, imagining the moment when I would finally step on stage and hear my name announced, the kind of moment that's supposed to make every struggle and late night worth it, and more than that. The kind of moment you want to share with the people who claim to love you most. I had pictured them in the front row, maybe not clapping the loudest, but at least being there, just existing in the same space, just proving to me that no matter what had happened in the past, when it came to something that defined my life, they could show up. That was the image I carried with me, almost like a shield against all the doubts and insecurities they had planted over the years, and I held on to it even when I started to sense the truth. They weren't coming. The morning had been filled with messages from colleagues, mentors, people I barely knew but who still cared enough to say they were proud of me, yet my phone stayed silent when it came to my family. Not a single text from my mom, not a quick good luck from my dad, not even a sarcastic jab from my sister that might have passed as her version of encouragement. At first, I convinced myself they were just waiting, that maybe they wanted to surprise me by walking in right before things started. I checked the time more than I checked my breathing. I kept glancing at the doors, hoping they would swing open and I'd see familiar faces. But every time, it was just strangers, or coworkers' families, or people who had no idea they were walking past an empty row that should have belonged to mine. When the coordinator came to get me, I still told myself there was a chance. People get caught in traffic, right? Maybe there was some last-minute issue. Maybe they had planned something bigger and were hiding it from me. I almost laughed at myself for still hoping, because deep down I knew what I had always known. They had made a decision long before this day ever came. They didn't value this the way I did, and more painfully, they didn't value me enough to put aside whatever petty excuses they had. Standing backstage, I heard my name called, and the sound of applause rose up, but instead of warmth it felt like a reminder of what was missing. I scanned the crowd as I stepped out, lights blinding me for a second, but even when my eyes adjusted, the seats I had reserved for them were glaringly empty. That row stared back at me like proof, like an open wound I couldn't cover. It was almost funny in a twisted way, how I still half expected to hear my mom's laugh or my dad's cough, anything, but there was nothing but strangers applauding for a woman they didn't know. I could have crumbled right there. I could have let the bitterness choke me, because every part of me screamed that this was just another confirmation of what I'd always been to them. Optional, forgettable, not worth the effort. But something inside me shifted. Instead of lowering my head, I lifted it. Instead of swallowing the pain quietly, I let it sharpen me. I walked across that stage, shaking hands, smiling for cameras, and with every step, I repeated in my head that I was here for me, not for them, that I had earned this moment, and no one could take that from me. When I reached the microphone, I paused longer than I was supposed to, the kind of silence that makes people nervous, the kind of pause that forces everyone to pay attention. My throat burned, not because I was about to cry, but because I was about to stop pretending. I leaned toward the microphone, looked directly into that empty row, and I said the words I knew they would hear about later. To everyone who couldn't be bothered to show up, keep that energy. The room was quiet for a beat, then exploded into applause, and I let it wash over me, not because it replaced the people who weren't there, but because it was my proof that I no longer needed them to validate me. By the time I walked off the stage, my phone was already buzzing in my bag. The ceremony wasn't even over yet, and the missed calls had started pouring in. If I am being honest, the silence that wrapped itself around the morning of my big day did not arrive as a surprise that knocked me off my feet so much as a familiar echo that I recognized immediately. Because I have lived long enough with a family that treats me like an optional extra to understand that when people insist they are supportive while doing absolutely nothing that resembles actual support, you start learning to read the gaps between their words, and those gaps tell a louder truth than any toast or card ever could. I grew up in a house where my effort was treated like a phase and my wins were recast as coincidences, where my brother's half-finished plans were described as visionary while my finished projects were filed under luck, where praise was rationed like something fragile that would shatter if it touched me, and when I pushed back against the double standard I was told I was dramatic, needy, too sensitive, too loud, too much, as if the real problem was not there. behavior but my nerve to notice it. Holidays felt like auditions for approval that never came, because every year I would bring something I made with care, a dish or a story or a small milestone I wanted to share. And every year the conversation would slide away from me like a plate being removed before I had a chance to taste it, turned toward whichever minor thing my sister had posted or whatever vague plan my brother claimed to be exploring, while I sat there biting my tongue and learning that attention in that house was not earned by consistency or substance, but by proximity to whoever they already decided mattered, and spoiler, that person was never me. When I got my first decent job, my mother told me not to get ahead of myself because stability is fickle, which was her polite version of saying she did not believe I could hold what I had worked for, and when I was promoted, my father asked whether I was sure they had not just needed to fill a quota, a sentence he later insisted was a joke I should not take personally, as if jokes are not often just truths people do not want to own. The pattern is not hard to chart if you lay it out, because there was the college acceptance they called an overreach, the move to a better apartment they called wasteful, the project I led that they downgraded to helping out, and the one time I asked them to show up for a small presentation, a trial run compared to what happened today. They agreed in a loose way that made it my fault for assuming they meant yes when they said yes, and when they failed to appear I was told that life gets busy. And I should be more understanding, as if understanding were a one-way street where I stood on the curb and waved while their car sped past me again and again. So when I found myself backstage hearing my name spoken into a room I had earned, it was not just the empty row that stung, it was the long chain of shrugged shoulders that led to it. The years of almosts and maybes and we will see that trained me to lower my expectations without ever admitting I had done it, and in that moment I decided I would not let their absence be the headline for a day that belonged to me. Which is why I did something quiet and, to me, cleaner than a scene, because I asked the coordinator to release the reserved seats with my last name on them to the group of local students who had written to me about wanting to see the ceremony, and I replaced the acknowledgement slide I had drafted months ago with their names tucked in politely alongside mentors who actually showed up, with a new one that said, simply and without apology, to those who did the work and those who came to witness it, you know who you are, which landed on the live stream in front of colleagues, neighbors, and members of our extended family who were already watching and who understood exactly what had changed, and suddenly the meaningful glances in the room were not mine to bear. I am not pretending it did not hurt to make that choice, and I am not claiming I did it without shaking, because anyone who has been trained from childhood to seek the approval of people who treat approval like a scarce prize knows how hard it is to stop trying. Yet the second that slide replaced the old one I felt something unclench, a small, stubborn knot loosened, and I understood that even if they never admit the history that led us here, I could decline to continue writing the same chapter, which is its own kind of payback, not loud, not cruel, and very clear. The best part, if I am allowed to say there was a best part, was that the students slid into those empty seats with a kind of joy that reminded me why the work matters, and when the camera panned past them, clapping like they had been invited all along, it felt like the space had been reclaimed for people who actually wanted to be part of it, a small correction to a long imbalance that had asked me to shrink so others could feel large. By the time I reached the reception hall, the fallout had already begun, because extended relatives had texted congratulations with little side notes about the bold dedication, and mutual friends had forwarded screenshots of my mother's frantic messages asking whether the stream could be edited after the fact, as if time could be rewound to rescue an image she had refused to show up and protect in the first place. And my phone lit up with that familiar roster of missed calls I had waited years to see, only to realize I did not want them now that they had arrived, and as I stood there listening to a mentor tell me she was proud, I opened the family group chat, attached a photo of the once reserved seats now filled with kids who were beaming, and I typed a single line that felt honest without being theatrical: "Thank you for making room," hit send, and set the phone face down on the table, already knowing that the message would land like a mirror they have avoided for a very long time, and that the next move, which I had been planning quietly for months, would make it impossible for them to pretend they had not heard me. When I stepped up to the microphone, I could hear my own pulse in my ears, not because I was afraid of speaking in front of a crowd, since I had been doing that for years, but because I knew that what I was about to say would end an old story I had been repeating to myself since childhood, the one where if I kept working and kept being gracious and kept making space for people who did not make space for me, then one day they would finally meet me halfway, which sounds noble until you realize it is just a long way of postponing your own dignity. I looked over the room, because I needed to feel the reality of it, the colleagues who had flown in on their own dime, the former manager who once advocated for me when no one else did, the students in the row that had been reserved under my last name until an hour before the ceremony, and then I looked at the gap where my family should have been and, with the kind of calm that only comes when you are finally tired enough to choose yourself, I decided not to pretend. I started with a standard thank you, because there were people who deserved to hear it aloud, and I named them carefully, one by one, saying exactly what they had done and why it mattered, and I felt the energy in the room lean toward me. And only then did I let the other words come out, the ones that had sat like a stone in my chest all morning, the ones I knew would travel beyond the walls whether I liked it or not, and I said that line again, not as a bitter jab but as a boundary that could finally stand on its own legs, that to everyone who could not be bothered to show up, please, keep that energy, because my future is going to be very busy accommodating people who do not need to be convinced I am worth a chair. There was a breath of silence that felt like a page turning, followed by applause that I registered but did not chase, because I had not said it for the reaction. I had said it to stop living like a translation of myself. And, while the room clapped, I took in a smaller moment that steadied me, the students in the front row snapping photos not of me but of each other, because the fact that they were there meant more than any performance of family pride that could have been staged in a matching outfit and posted later with a caption about how they always knew I had it in me. What I did not tell the audience, though I had mapped it out weeks ago for the possibility that this exact day might arrive, was that I had prepared a packet with our communications team that would go live as soon as my speech ended. A simple page that included my remarks, the names of the mentors and colleagues I had thanked, and a small announcement that the honorarium attached to today's event would seed a fund for first-generation professionals to cover travel and lodging when they are invited to moments like this, because talent is not the same as access, and I wanted the headline to be about the people who would benefit rather than the people who chose not to be present. While I was still on stage, the notifications began pinging the inside of my bag, and later I would see the sequence unfold exactly as I expected it would. Because the live stream clipped the part of my speech where I drew the line and posted it with the caption from our team that was deliberately free of drama, a clean statement of gratitude and boundary. And the page went up with photographs of the students in the once reserved seats, and within minutes my extended family had started texting. Not to apologize but to manage optics, asking whether the language could be softened and whether the clip could be edited, and whether I realized how this might look to people who did not have the full context. To which I responded with something I had drafted the night before and saved in my notes, a single message addressed to the family thread that read, "I will not be editing my life to protect anyone's comfort, and if you have something to say, put it in writing and send it to my email with the subject line apology, because voice notes and half sentences have done enough damage in this family, and I am finished decoding tone." Once the speech wrapped, I stepped off the stage into a corridor where my mentor hugged me and told me I had said exactly what needed to be said, and I believed her because she was there, and then I pulled out my phone, opened the settings I had been avoiding out of habit for years, and changed two small things that felt enormous, because I removed my parents' numbers from my emergency contacts and replaced them with my friend Elise and my colleague Mateo, people who actually pick up when I call, and I turned on a filter that sends any unrecognized number straight to voicemail so that if the calls came they would not swallow the rest of my day, and then I opened my professional page and pinned the statement, not as a dig, but as a declaration. And as the comments started filling with encouragement from people who had been waiting their whole lives to hear someone say it plainly, I understood that I had just shut the door on the old script. The revenge, if we are calling it that, was not a spectacle. It was procedural and unambiguous, and it hurt only where it needed to, because I took away the thing they valued most, which is the right to rewrite the narrative after the fact. And as I walked back toward the reception hall with my phone vibrating like a trapped bee, I saw the screen light up with my mother's name and the words incoming call, and for the first time in years I did not brace myself. I just let it ring until it stopped, because the next move would not be on the phone at all. By the time the reception had quieted and I finally sat down with a plate of food that I barely touched, my phone was buzzing so often it might as well have been a fire alarm. And each vibration carried the name of someone who had not bothered to walk through the doors earlier but who now, suddenly, felt the urge to reach out as if their absence could be undone by a frantic call. I watched the names scroll across the screen like a parade of people who had trained me for years to expect little and then punish me for noticing the lack. And there was my mother trying twice in a row before leaving a voicemail. There was my father calling once. Then again, then switching to text messages with the same clipped language he always used when he was cornered. There was my sister alternating between calls and group chat messages as though flooding me with notifications would erase the silence that had preceded them, and even a few cousins who almost never reached out were suddenly eager to prove that they were part of something they had never actually joined in the first place. I let the phone sit face down, but eventually curiosity won, and I listened to the voicemails not because I expected sincerity, but because I wanted to confirm that my instincts had been right, and of course they were. My mother's voice cracked as she said she did not realize how important this was to me, which was absurd because I had told her months in advance, sent reminders, even forwarded the official program with the time circled. And her tone was not the tone of someone truly apologizing, but the tone of someone caught out and desperate to smooth the optics before anyone else drew conclusions. My father's message was worse, because instead of even pretending remorse, he sounded irritated, as if my acknowledgement of their absence had embarrassed him. As if the problem was not that they did not come, but that I had dared to say out loud that they did not come, and he left a line that will probably stick with me forever. You didn't have to make it a spectacle, which told me everything I already knew about how he views me, as someone responsible for his discomfort rather than someone allowed to speak her own truth. My sister's messages were an almost comic mixture of outrage and manipulation, because in one text she accused me of humiliating the family. In the next she insisted she had planned to arrive, but got stuck at the last minute. In the next she tried to twist it into a joke about me being so dramatic, and by the time I finished scrolling through them I could see the pattern as clearly as I could see my own hands. None of them were actually sorry for not being there, they were sorry for being called out. Sitting there, surrounded by people who had chosen to come without obligation, who celebrated me without calculation, I realized that the ringing phone represented something bigger than a string of calls. It represented the sudden recognition on their part that they might finally lose their grip on the story they had been writing about me for years. For so long they had treated me as an afterthought who would still chase their approval, and now they were confronted with a version of me who had stopped chasing, who had drawn a line in public, in front of witnesses, and who had no intention of retracting it. That realization, more than my speech itself, was what had them scrambling, because once you lose control of the narrative you cannot simply walk back in and demand it be handed over again. The temptation to answer, to finally hear them say the words I had wanted for years, hovered for a moment, but it faded quickly when I remembered that genuine accountability does not arrive wrapped in excuses or accusations, and certainly not in the tone of people who are furious they have been exposed. So instead of picking up, I opened the family group chat and typed a single sentence that I knew would cut deeper than any long argument. I am not available to fix a situation you created. I hit send, muted the chat, and placed the phone back in my bag, because the next part of this process was not about defending myself to them, but about protecting the space I had carved out for myself in the aftermath of their absence. The irony, which was not lost on me, was that for years I had begged silently for them to call me, to check in, to make an effort, and when those calls finally came, stacked one after another until my phone looked like a switchboard, I found I had no desire to answer, no hunger for what used to feel like a lifeline, because I had already built something sturdier out of people who cared without condition. And perhaps that was the sharpest revenge of all, not the public line I delivered from the stage, not the slide that erased their names, not even the silence I gave back to their noise, But the fact that when the moment they thought I always wanted finally arrived, I did not want it anymore, and I let it pass by like static on a radio, because the truth is you cannot miss something that has already been replaced. What I did next was deliberate and, in its own way, irreversible, because I scrolled through the list of missed calls and voicemails, and instead of deleting them or pretending they never happened, I screenshotted them and filed them into a folder labeled Record. Not for vengeance in the petty sense, but for evidence, a reminder to myself that on the day when they could have stood in my corner and didn't, they chose absence until the optics forced them to chase me, and I never again wanted to. Forget that distinction. Then, after creating that record, I blocked my father's number and my sister's as well, leaving my mother's unblocked not out of softness, but out of strategy, because I knew she would keep calling. And her voicemails would eventually reveal more about the truth than any fight we could have face-to-face, and I wanted her words to pile up in my inbox like receipts I could use later. As I closed my phone for the last time that night, I looked around the room and noticed how light I felt, almost unnervingly light, because the weight of chasing had lifted, and I understood with startling clarity that the next move would not be theirs but mine. And it would not be a response to their behavior, but a declaration of my own, and that thought, more than anything else, carried me out of the reception hall and into the night with a sense of certainty I had never felt before. The morning after the ceremony, I woke up before my alarm not because I was anxious about the fallout or bracing for another round of calls, but because a clear plan had finally settled in my head like furniture placed exactly where it belongs. And although part of me had been trained to believe that decisive action was rude when family was involved, another part, the part that got me on that stage in the first place, understood that boundaries without consequences are just speeches, so I made coffee, opened my laptop, and began turning the quiet decisions I had been sketching for months into actions that could not be softened, reframed, or explained away after the fact. I started with the simple administrative cuts people pretend are small, but that actually define who gets access to your life, because I logged into my benefits portal and removed my parents from anything that allowed them to speak on my behalf, updated my healthcare proxy to list Elise and Mateo, revoked the shared drive permissions my sister had been using to peek at my calendar, changed the emergency contact on every account that still had my mother's number from a decade ago, and then I moved to the money I had been pretending did not bother me even as it did. The autopay that covered my sister's phone line because she always promised to pay me back, the contribution that quietly lowered my parents' insurance premiums because it had once felt easier to help than to argue, and the streaming accounts I had allowed my brother to connect to half the extended family as if access were proof of closeness, and I canceled every single one of them without anger and without announcement, because the absence of a privilege speaks louder than a text ever will. When the first confused messages arrived, my sister asking whether my card had expired because her service had suddenly cut off, my father forwarding a notice about the insurance adjustment with a question mark as though this were an error, my mother leaving a long voicemail about how humiliating it was to be treated like a stranger by her own daughter. I did not rush to educate them. I simply replied with the same line I had used on stage rewritten for the ledger, that household benefits follow household behavior, and if you choose not to show up then please, keep that energy everywhere, which is not cruelty so much as symmetry, and the way the room goes quiet when symmetry arrives is its own kind of justice. I knew they would test the boundary, so I built the next step before they reached for it, because I drafted a single email addressed to the family thread and blind copied the few extended relatives who always try to mediate. A message that thanked the people who had shown up, restated that my boundaries were not negotiable, and offered a path forward that did not require performative remorse, which was a link to the fund our team had launched from the honorarium with a note that anyone who wanted a seat at future milestones could sponsor a seat for a student who would otherwise watch from a screen, and that names of sponsors, not relatives, would be printed on the program, so if my family wanted their names present they would need to behave like participants rather than critics. Predictably, my father responded with a paragraph about how money cannot buy love, which would have been profound if he had been talking to himself, and my sister sent a tangle of messages about how public charity is fake generosity. which would have sounded less ridiculous if it had not been typed from a phone I had funded for years, and my mother left another voicemail that meandered from accusation to nostalgia to pleading, insisting that family should not have to buy their way into rooms where they belong, to which I answered once and only once that belonging is proven by effort, and that the fund is not a toll but a mirror, and if you do not like what it shows you can change the reflection by showing up next time. I did not need them to accept it for the plan to work, because the point was never to convert them into better people overnight. It was to remove the reward structure that let them perform absence without consequence, and to replace it with a structure that turned my anger into opportunity for someone who would actually use the seat. The final piece, the one I had delayed because I knew it would end the last lingering habit of seeking permission, was to archive the family group chat that had been my private hallway for years, the place where I tried to be reasonable, the place where I begged, joked, minimized, and forgave, and I renamed it Archive, posted a single message explaining that I would not be participating in further discussions about my decisions, attached a transcript of my mother's voicemails and my father's texts to their respective emails titled Apology as I had requested, and then I muted the thread for a year and moved it out of sight, not as a stunt, but as a filing decision, because some stories belong in storage once you stop living inside them. That afternoon, our communications team posted a short update announcing the first 2 scholarships from the fund, including a candid photo of the students who had filled the empty row at my ceremony and a sentence thanking the unnamed sponsors whose names would appear on the next program, and as the comments poured in from strangers who understood exactly what kind of boundary had been drawn, my phone buzzed with a final burst of calls that I watched without touching, because the truth had landed where it needed to, and my part was done. The revenge, if you insist on calling it that, was not loud or theatrical. It was a ledger balanced, a policy updated, a seat reassigned, and a future redirected toward people who come when they say they will. And, while there are still corners of me that ache for a version of family that might never exist, I can live with that ache, because I have finally chosen myself without flinching, and the missed calls can keep piling up in a folder called Record, because they no longer require me to answer.